Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Buddhist Path of Awakening course. Barry, can you control the view?
Yep, it's done.
Well, I'm looking at Karen Symington Mundell
Well,
filling the screen.
I've got you spotlighted for everyone.
Nope.
Well,
That's odd.
let me redo it.
I just removed the pin from her. Somehow that happened. Okay. So welcome, everyone. We are we're actually beginning the first chapter of the third volume rather, of the Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma by Chogyam Trungpa. This is a digest of 15 years worth of talks given at seminary every year, a program for about 150 to 250 people that each year extended over 3 months. And we have covered the first two volumes of the digests of these talks. The first one being on the Hinayana teachings, the foundational teachings, the second being on the Mahayana teachings, the greater vehicle teachings, and now we are beginning to make our way through the third volume on the Vajrayana teachings. Tonight, Michael is going to be teaching, so Michael, take it away.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. The title of the chapter that I'll be talking about tonight is The Dawning of the Great Eastern Sun. And so what I'll be doing is sharing my understanding and experience of the chapter, and then John will make some comments, and then there'll be time for comments and questions as always, which I hope people will share without hesitation. Transcending hesitation is very much part of the Vajrayana. I have to say that I approach this material with some trepidation because Trungpa Rinpoche always presented a fair number of warnings about the teachings altogether, but the Vajrayana in particular, mainly in regard to the dangers of spiritual materialism, which in regard to the Vajrayana in particular would mean that either trying to create and cling to some kind of experience that we think we should have or could have, something that's fabricated rather than something genuine or natural, thinking that somehow we should experience something better than what actually is, or having had some experience or glimpse, clinging to that experience. And this is one of the reasons why the Hinayana and Mahayana foundations are so important as we approach the Vajrayana. That we begin by developing sitting meditation discipline in the Hinayana so that we can relate to our actual experience rather than be absorbed in distraction, hopes and fears. We study the Hinayana so we can develop some understanding of how ego functions and develop some understanding of karma, or how we develop habitual patterns, or you could say the ways in which we identify with concepts and beliefs and perceptions, and then project them outward. And then going further in the Mahayana, we develop an appreciation of our inherent innate bodhicitta, awakened heart, and come to understand something of the experience of emptiness and twofold egolessness, so that we can become open to the world with compassion for all beings. And this preparation, this foundation is what allows us to simply be with ourselves, be with our experience, be with the world just as it is. So in presenting my understanding of the dawn of the Great Eastern Sun and this introduction to the Vajrayana, I'm not saying it's the only way to understand it, but it's at least how I understand it. And that's why I think it's important that when we have time for comments and questions, that people feel free to contribute. I think people know that there are different ways that the Buddha's teachings have been categorized over the years. I think we're pretty familiar with teachings being divided up into the Hinayana, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana, or the foundational vehicle, the greater vehicle, and the indestructible vehicle, We've studied the five paths, path of accumulation, unification, and seeing, and so on. I want to introduce one more way of dividing the Buddhist teachings up. Sometimes it's talked about the teachings as provisional and definitive or ultimate. So the provisional teachings or the definitive or ultimate teachings. And the idea of the provisional teachings is that these are teachings that are based on what the people being taught are able to understand. Whereas the definitive or ultimate teachings present an ultimate point of view, which is really what the Vajrayana is. But this doesn't mean that the provisional teachings are wrong or exactly incomplete. It's more that as we develop in our study and practice, we come to understand things on deeper and deeper level. So to give an example, in the Hinayana, we talk about impermanence, the fact that things change, because that's fairly easy for people to understand, at least as an external phenomena, and perhaps on a gross level in terms of people's change over, years and years of time. We're well aware that things change. And as we come to understand impermanence, come to understand something as well, again in the Hinayana, about letting go of attachment, or coming to understand how attachment and clinging bring suffering, both because of the loss of whatever it is that we're attached to, as well as all the pain that comes out of our attempts to control and manipulate and struggle with our experience to try to hold on to things. In the Mahayana, the same sense of impermanence leads to a deeper understanding of emptiness, the fact that things don't have inherent existence in the way that we talked about in our study of the Mahayana, that the fact that things change, the fact that things are don't have permanent existence, leads to an understanding of emptiness, and eventually even twofold egolessness as well, because we come to understand that we change, the phenomena around us, the world changes, and this leads to some understanding of emptiness. And then on the level of the Vajrayana, I could say that this deepens even further with the notion of sacredness or sacred outlook, the uniqueness, the preciousness of each individual thing. As John said last week, that things have value for no particular reason at all, just that they are, and that things exist just as they are. And we can appreciate the notion of sacredness, veneration, things just for their beauty, their presence, even as they don't have any inherent existence. Things change, things are fleeting. So in that sense, there are provisional teachings, again, which relate to what we're able to understand at a particular point in time, and then definitive teachings, which are involved with seeing the full truth. But it's not that the provisional teachings are wrong. It's just that as we develop in our practice and study, our ability to understand, our perceptions, our comprehension changes over time. And for that reason, sometimes the teachings, particularly the Vajrayana, are called self-secret, in that we understand the teachings when we do. And it's not that anything's being held back from us, it's more that we understand at the level that we're able to understand. So with the Vajrayana, in my own experience, it's taken me some time to understand some actually fairly simple things that it took me a while to understand because of need to let go, the need to study, the need to practice and work with these things over time. So basically, in this chapter, Trungpa Rinpoche talks about the Great Eastern Sun and the setting sun. These are primarily Shambhala terms from his Shambhala teachings. This chapter is a combination of talks that were given at the 1976 and 1978 seminaries. And I think it's not particularly useful tonight, I think, to get into too much comparing and contrasting of the Buddhist versus the Shambhala teachings, what's traditional Buddhist versus Shambhala. In some ways, it's different language to describe the same things. And sometimes it's helpful to hear things in different words because we understand something or are able to put two things together, hearing it in different ways. So the Shambhala teachings are quite powerful, quite beautiful in their own right. But in this case, I think what's more helpful is to understand what it is that's being pointed out to us, what it is that Trungpa Rinpoche, in talking about the Great Eastern Sun, in talking about the Vajrayana, in talking about the Dawn of Vajrasattva, which comes up in this chapter, what it is that he's asking us to see, what it is that we're meant to come to recognize. So let's start. Basically, the chapter begins with some discussion of both the Great Eastern Sun vision and setting sun vision. As he says, if there were no such thing as the Great Eastern Sun, the Vajrayana could not be presented at all. If you do not have the East, you cannot have the sun shining out of the East. And he says that in this case, the East is the Mahayana, and the sun shining out of the East is Vajrayana. The vision is Mahayana, and executing the vision is Vajrayana, always. In fact, he says there's no vision in the Vajrayana because you do not need it. Vision is a futuristic experience, whereas execution is the present situations. You only need execution. If you do not execute properly, you cut your finger, which is bad execution. So in talking about execution and in talking about the Vajrayana, what he's talking about is very immediate experience of nowness, the very immediate experience of awareness, the very immediate experience of what John talked about last week as Rigpa, wisdom, intelligence, wakefulness. Not in any created sense, but in the moment, on the spot experience. And out of that comes execution because there's no separation, there's no duality. So it's awareness, nowness without hesitation, you could say. And he says, as opposed to this, there's also the Great West. And it's funny to go through this chapter and think too much about actual locations in the world and different cultures. But I think primarily we're talking about a state of mind, state of being here. And it's more useful to think of it in that way, even though he does go back and forth about the Orient and the West. But in any case, the idea of the Great West is the setting sun, which he calls the destroying of light. This is very similar if you've studied or worked with the I Ching. There's some of the hexagrams in the I Ching that talk about, use the sun as a metaphor for wakefulness, expansion, openness, and contrarily, the setting sun, darkening of the light. Basically, the setting sun is a state of mind or a state of being, as well as a culture that, as he says, has created conditions that block any possibilities of presenting enlightenment. It's an approach that has provided us with beautiful, comfortable conditions for living our life. And he goes on to give some examples like central heating, air conditioning, and so on. But ultimately, the setting sun approach has provided us purely with a comfortable way to die. Again, destroying of the light, destroying the possibilities of genuine, fresh, immediate existence. What he's talking about here is the tendency in setting sun vision to be attached to comfort and security, to staying with the known and predictable, trying to control experience, trying to control ourselves, trying to control our world. It's an attachment, you could say, to the cut and dried, so that we stay absorbed in comfort and stay absorbed in entertainments of all kinds. We make ourselves numb, deaf and dumb, as we talked about a little bit last week. And he gives more examples like old age homes, funeral homes, and so on, so that we can realize how to make the sunset, meaning the sunset of human dignity, the sun of human power. So all those things, he goes on to say, all those things that we have in the Great West. And again, I think that it's important to understand this as a state of mind or approach to life. But he says that all the things we have in the Great West, philosophy, psychology, economic development, have been about learning to die rather than learning to rise. Because in seeking comfort and seeking security and seeking predictability, we cut off the freshness of present, immediate, wakeful experience. As he says, hopefully you will not take this as a personal insult, but the West at this point is equivalent to the setting sun. It's equivalent to anti-enlightenment, and it's very wretched. And he says this is because there's too much poverty mentality. So in other words, the problem isn't that central heating or air conditioning are bad or should be rejected and so on, but it's more a question of attitude of clinging, an attitude of attachment, an attitude that is essentially the approach of ego, of trying to make everything predictable, looking for permanence, looking for solidity, looking for comfort and security, looking for safety in a way that becomes numbing, that closes us off, that shuts us down. So that's what setting sun vision is. He says that the business and investment of people in the West, and again, think of this as an approach to life, a way of being, is based on pleasure, while people in the East base their activity more on responsibility because of the very fact that they do not have that much pleasure. There's a lot of ways to think about what he might mean with responsibility, but one thing that I'll just mention is the notion of interconnectedness, mutuality of people and things versus rugged individuality. That when we realize our interconnectedness with the world and with other beings, then we have a sense of responsibility to others, a sense of responsibility to the world. Whereas when we're just caught up in our own individual comfort, our own individual security, our own individual gaining and accumulating, then when we're just based on that kind of short-sighted pleasure, then there is no responsibility. Anyway, he goes on to say, the idea of Great East is not simply a question of Eastern versus Western people. We're talking about mind, about conquering mind. It's a matter of where mind rests and whether you're interested in pleasure or responsibility. So he goes on to say that in talking about the Great Eastern Kingdom, Great Eastern Sun, or the Vajrayana, we're all synonymous here. He says we mean a human dawn, a dawn of humanity in which Vajrayana can be presented, in which it could happen in our experience. We're learning how to rise rather than how to die. So again, in helping us to understand what the Great Eastern Sun vision is, understand what the Vajrayana is, again, I think he is trying to help us see something in our experience, something that we can recognize, which is our fundamental awareness, our fundamental ability to be awake, our ability to be present, our ability to fully relate to the world, fully relate to ourselves in an open, unconditioned manner. So he says that there are three qualities of the Great East. This is another way of, again, understanding what it is that we're meant to recognize in our experience. And the first is that he says that it's primordial. So ordinarily, I think we might think of primordial as something very ancient or going way back in time. Something, fundamental, original, elemental. But in this case, we're not talking about going back in time, but really understanding right now, in this immediate moment, what original mind, the essence of mind, awake mind is now, right now. What is awareness? What is wakefulness in the immediate wakeful sense? And this primordial mind, which we experience all the time if we allow ourselves to recognize it, is before there's any elaboration of ego, before we get caught up in concepts, judgments, evaluations, analysis, speculation, all of the complication of ego, all the complication of conditioned existence, and just simply settle into this present moment right now, right on the spot. So in this sense, it's primordial. It's the beginning. It's first thought before there's any elaboration, before there's any fabrication of ego. As he says, the present cannot be manipulated and the past cannot be manipulated. So you live longer because you're not hampered by manipulation. Think of manipulation as all of the strategies, all of the habitual patterns, all of the judgments, all of the attempts to seek pleasure, avoid pain, all of the things that go into the functioning of ego, all the conditioning. And the primordial quality of Great Eastern Sun vision is before that, which there's always that gap, always that possibility, whether we recognize it or not. The second quality of the Great Eastern vision is that it's eternal. That it can eternally exist, that eternity can exist independent of manipulation. And in some ways, this reminded me going back to the chapters we read in the first book of the Profound Treasury, The Path of Individual Liberation, where he talks about Vipassana meditation. And he says, whatever we experience in Vipassana, he actually used the word disown. We let go. Because what happens is, even if we do have a flash of nowness, if we then try to possess it, contain it, hold on to it, then in a subtle way, we're already actually living in the past. We're living in our past experience rather than staying fresh, rather than sustaining awareness. So it's actually by letting go and by disowning that we can experience the eternal present, which in the end is all that there is, all that there really is. We may dream, become distracted, entertained, numbed, but ultimately all there really ever is this endless, eternal present that we can experience directly. And so, however, even though we might dream differently, in fact, we can rest in awareness. We can rest in this present moment. We can rest in our basic awake essence of mind. And as thoughts, feelings, and perceptions come and go, but awareness is eternal, though our recognition of it is not. It's our recognition that goes up and down. It's our recognition of our awareness or our distraction from our awareness that actually changes. But the awareness itself, that fundamental awake quality of mind, is always there. Then the last quality of the Great East Vision is what he calls self-existent, or I think Lundrup. And this is because, or he also says this also means spontaneously present. And he says it could also be described as simplicity. Lundrup, self-existent, means that in the Vajrayana, the basic nature is continuous and at the same time self-existent. In other words, our awareness isn't dependent on causes and conditions. It isn't something that, it doesn't arise from causes and conditions. We don't need to create it. We just need to tune into it, become aware of it, recognize it. Again, it comes back to recognition. And therefore, it does not cease. So those are the three qualities of Great East Vision. These are things that we can experience and that we do experience in meditation practice, either provisionally or here we're perhaps talking about it in a more definitive or ultimate way. But we have some experience of what it means to be present and how our experience feels different to us when we're present as opposed to when we're distracted. To thank Sue for reminding me of a quote from William Blake that I actually think describes these qualities very well. The quote is, "He who binds himself to a joy does the winged life destroy. But he who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise." I'll read it again. "He who binds to himself a joy does the winged life destroy," which I think would be a good description of setting sun, trying to hold on, fearful of losing something. But he who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. So William Blake also has the metaphor, the analogy of the sun as one way of understanding what it means to be fully present, fully awake, and not cling to our experience, but be open to whatever is arising. Because when we do cling, when we hold on, again, that destroys, that does the winged life destroy. Anyway, Trungpa Rinpoche goes on to say that Vajrayana discipline can be presented in terms of these three qualities, primordial, eternal, and self-existent. And he says you could view the three characteristics as a transformation of the three marks of samsaric existence: suffering, change, or impermanence, and egolessness. He says suffering is transformed into Dhamma, or primordial existence or bliss. And I think this is, again, because we're fully present, fully awake, fully now, fully here. And that this is bliss, this is awake. Change becomes takpa, the continuous freshness of eternal existence, which again has to do with simply being able to rest in the present moment without trying to alter it in any way, as we say in the chants that we do. And finally, egolessness becomes Lundrup, unborn, self-existing being, simply being without any kind of conditioning, any kind of clinging to a particular identity. So the next section in the reading was called the Dawn of Sanity. Trungpa Rinpoche says the Vajrayana principles are not particularly the possessions of the Orientals, which would be absurd, but they represent the intelligence and awareness of the rising sun. And you're giving up connections. We're giving up connections to the setting sun. The Great Eastern Sun. The Great East is also referred to as the dawn of Vajrasattva. Vajrasattva means indestructible being, Vajra being. It is as though light is coming from the east and you have a glimpse of that possibility of awakening. So again, it's a matter of recognizing that it's not something separate out there, separate from ourselves, but it's something that is in our experience, something that is nothing that we have to create, nothing we have to fabricate. We just need to recognize, tune into it. Anyway, he says, so dawn means to awaken, and Vajrasattva or Vajra being is what we're awakening to. So what I'd suggest is that for just a moment, we take a good posture and do exactly what he says. Well, again, I think everyone knows that by a good posture, we mean upright, but at the same time, relaxed, straight back, settle into our seat, whatever that might be. Allow ourselves to slow down, simplify, and just settle into present awareness without hesitation, without further thought, without expectation, without effort. Simply relax. It can help to take a deep breath. As we breathe out, just let go completely into the present moment, into simple being, primordial mind, eternal presence, just self-existing awareness. Simple nowness. Thank you. So, say just a little bit more about this topic of setting sun and rising sun. He says that when we talk about the rising sun, we mean an eternally sane attitude, an experience in which the Vajrayana is happening. The rising sun only comes from there being no setting sun. Setting sun is related with theism and rising sun with non-theism. The rising sun is saner because it's giving birth. The setting sun is dwelling on depression. the Great Eastern Sun vision approach is based on the non-theistic approach of shunyata, or emptiness, that nobody has any basis at all. Everything is simple, so there's fullness all the time. That combination of simplicity and fullness is the ultimate culture, loneliness. Or again, a complete appreciation of the uniqueness, clarity, and beauty, vividness of this present moment. So it's being on that edge of nowness that is the Vajrayana, the Great Eastern Sun vision. Awake. Of course, that's not all. The next section is actually on Buddhahood. So this is a little bit more about the nature of the recognition or understanding, the kind of confidence we actually develop, you could say, the shift of allegiance, as John talked about last week, that occurs as we go from the Mahayana to the Vajrayana. And I think that there's one sentence that really sums it up, which I'll read now, and then we'll work our way up to. He says, it's no longer just Buddha nature that you have within you, but a fully developed Buddhahood, completely and utterly. And to get to that, what he says is that the immense power and heroism of the Great Eastern Sun, as it begins to dawn on us, it's necessary to realize how that can be conducted and worked with properly. The possibility of doing so comes from the realization of basic non-theistic Buddhism. Non-theistic in the sense, not only that we don't need anything external to save us or to be added to us. As John said last week, we're whole from the beginning, but we don't know that. In the Vajrayana, we actually come to recognize that wholeness right from the beginning, that we're complete as we are. The possibility of this comes from the realization of basic non-theistic Buddhism, not taking anything as solid, as having solid identity. At this point, a person's realization of the truth of twofold egolessness of self and egolessness of phenomena, goes beyond the highest level of the Bodhisattva path. It goes beyond the experience of indestructible meditation or Vajra Samadhi. You begin to realize that so-called Tathagata Garbha, or Buddha nature, is futile. It's futile because your experience is no longer Garbha, which means essence or nature. It is no longer just Buddha nature that you have within you, but fully developed Buddhahood, completely and utterly. This also connects with some of what we talked about last week with gradual and sudden enlightenment, that we have the possibility of full Buddhahood in us now. Again, the question is, do we recognize that? Do we have confidence in that? Do we have trust in that? Can we simply relax into that without clinging, without spiritual materialism? In the Vajrayana, he goes on to say, in the Vajrayana, instead of regarding practices such as benevolence and so forth in the context of an embryonic state from which you could awaken your Buddha nature, you realize that your Buddha nature is present already. It is fully awakened now. Again, that we're fully developed Buddhas, or we have that possibility in us, and we can recognize that at any time. Therefore, the Mahayana is known as the yana of the seed, and the Vajrayana is known as the yana of the fruition. And he says, if you do not understand the Mahayana, it's difficult to get into the Vajrayana. If you don't realize the seed, you cannot have an understanding of the fruit. Goes on to make a couple of interesting statements that worth some contemplation, at least in terms of understanding what we're doing in Vajrayana practice. He says in the Vajrayana, the ground is more emphasized, but in order to realize the ground, you have to go through the disciplines. And when the ground is realized, that is attainment. So the ground is the fruition. Understanding the ground as the fruition means that there is fruit already. So what is the ground? It's our fundamentally completely awake natural mind. But that's just a name. That's not the experience. It's not the actual genuine recognition. But this again goes back to that notion of gradual versus sudden enlightenment, that we have the possibility of fully developed Buddhahood within us not simply essence, not simply possibility, but in the Vajrayana, we work with recognizing full Buddhahood on the spot. A complete understanding of the Mahayana is not a complete understanding of the Vajrayana, he says, but it gets us halfway through. Taking the bodhisattva vow is based on having immense devotion to the seed and the possibilities of the seed. It's the Garbha principle. You're relating to the Garbha or essence of everything. But the idea of Garbha is still very much a poverty approach. And interestingly enough, he talks a little bit about Shantideva and his, the brilliant Mahayana presentation that is the way of the Bodhisattva that Shantideva wrote. And it's true that when in the beginning of the way of the Bodhisattva, the first chapter, Shantideva talks about, again, think of this as provisional teaching as opposed to definitive teaching, how we live in confusion, live in darkness, and that the experience of bodhicitta, he says, is like a flash of lightning in a dark, dark night that for a moment illuminates everything. But then the rest of the Mahayana is developing that initial flash of bodhicitta. Whereas in the Vajrayana, he says your poverty is your wealth and neurosis is sanity. That's not simple to deduce, but it's true. We can work with everything, that we can work with our entire experience from the point of view of full, complete wakefulness, full, complete Buddhahood. In the Mahayana, he says, you're looking into yourself, looking for that essence or seed. But in the Vajrayana, you're looking out because you already have the fruition. So that's the ground and that's the fruition. You're not looking for some essence, you're looking for the real thing. You already have a fully grown up child, he says, in your womb. And this is, again, just a little bit of a side into the Shambhala teachings, which really begin with the ground, which is some understanding of basic goodness, our basic, fundamental, unconditioned, awake nature, that's the ground and that's the fruition at the same time. When we fully realize it, when we shift our allegiance, when we completely identify with basic goodness, fully identify with our Buddha nature. And then in the last section actually deals with another concept that comes out of the Shambhala teachings, which is creating an enlightened society. And remember here that in these talks, he's talking to a group of people at seminary who've done a fair amount of practice and study. So he's talking about both the enlightened society that might have been created in the seminary setting, but he's also talking about the wider world and creating an enlightened society for the benefit of all beings. He says, we're trying to create a Buddhist world, an enlightened society. And one of the principal ways of doing that is for each one of us to become sane. For each one of us to become sane. To become sane, you have to become disciplined. In order to become disciplined, you have to develop a sense of loyalty, which he says is not loyalty at the boss and worker level. In other words, some kind of hierarchical sense of loyalty, but rather it's an appreciation of what we're involved in. It's an appreciation of what we're working toward in our practice and study, the possibility of liberation for the benefit of all sentient beings. That's what we aspire to. And he says there's two levels of loyalty, and he goes on to describe the setting sun version, which is based on fear, or really hope and fear. He talks about the fear that you might lose your job, your status. You might have the hope of going to the beach, lying in the dirt. You might hope that your children have the same kind of process, the same kinds of situations available to you. But he says that Great Eastern Sun loyalty is more fundamental. It's not based on possession, status, clinging, and so on. That it's more fundamental. It's a question of what you are than who you. It's a question of who you are. What are you? And this comes back again to coming to recognize that we have the potentiality, we can be fully awakened Buddhas, not just potential, but we can fully realize, full Buddhahood, full wakefulness, fully being present. And he says, by testing our setting sun approach and the territoriality of ego, you have a chance to look at these situations and find out who and what you are. that for a long, long time, we've identified ourselves with ego, we've identified ourselves with our confusion, with our suffering, and that instead we can actually come to recognize and identify with our intelligence, our sanity, our beauty. And he says the Buddhist path is good, extremely good. And he says he can tell on a very simple level if a person walking on the street is a practitioner from the way they walk and how they hold their head and shoulders. And he says we could be cheerful. We could raise our head and shoulders and look straight ahead. Again, Great Eastern Sun vision, fully awake, present. We could be disciplined and compact at the Hinayana level. We could be disciplined, gentle, and loving at the Mahayana level. And at the Vajrayana level, we could just be there. Be there fully, be there completely, be there completely awake. He says, once you've understood, once you've studied and practiced, you might actually have to do something. Together, we might need to wake up the whole world from its sleep and create an enlightened society in accordance with Great Eastern Sun vision. So we should appreciate one another. We should appreciate that we're going to create a wakeful world. And that's how the chapter ends. So, John, you can take it from there.
That was terrific, Michael. Thank you very much. And I don't have any very much to add. These Shambhala teachings are really beautiful, I think. And what this chapter, this dawning of the Great Eastern Sun, is emphasizing, you see the sun always rises in the east. That's why it's the rising sun. It's new, it's fresh, and it's setting in the west. For your amusement, Rinpoche visited Esalen, Trungpa Rinpoche, and he felt it was very setting sun, all oriented towards pleasure. This beautiful view of looking out over the Pacific from hot tubs, as I recall him talking about it. I've never been there. And the setting sun really represents the self-indulgence of egotism, the constant search for pleasure and the avoidance of pain, which exists in our minds and keeps us very busy, as opposed to the rising sun approach, which is about recognizing this world and ourselves as they exist right now, in all of their freshness, constant change, in the moment, vividness, beauty, and appreciation for that. Setting sun is like an overlay. It means that we take this freshness and newness that is constantly appearing before us and in us, and instead we overlay it with our comments, our wishes, the ego's wishes, ego's stratagems, its hopes and fears, its wishing that things were different. And this overlay is what constitutes the setting sun approach. It's mean because there's a no appreciation of this beautiful world as it arises now. And so the Vajrayana is all about the rising sun, the great eastern sun as it rises in the east, as opposed to the setting sun as it sets in the west. It's all about, too, in our state of mind, our state of meditation, that we come present here and now. In other contexts, he calls it the synchronization of body and mind. When mind and body are unsynchronized, then we're thinking, we're lost in thought, anxious thought, hope and fear, stratagems, whatever it might be, while we're right here in the present, but we're seeing the present through this veil, a veil of anxiety and wishing things were different, as opposed to when mind and body are synced. This is it, right here and now. The thoughts vanish, they dissolve, and instead there's just pure awareness, which is indistinguishable from the things it's aware of. the blackness of this sweater, the pinkness of these cheeks, the sounds of these words, all of these things are one with our awareness of them. That's the synchronization of body and mind. And it's in that synchronization, true meditation, that the appreciation of the great eastern sun lies. This is where it happens, in this synchronization of body and mind, and this complete awareness without distraction. This is what the Vajrayana is all about. It's also what the Shambhala teachings are all about. And a number of us have discussed this, Michael and I and some others. And we've decided that we're going to put the third volume of the Profound Treasury on hold for a little bit, and instead go through the book Shambhala, The Sacred Path of the Warrior. It's a relatively short book, but it will illuminate a lot of what's in the Vajrayana. It will give us the correct attitude, the correct viewpoint that will help us understand the Vajrayana, so that we don't get overwhelmed by the detail of the Vajrayana. It will give us the heart. It also was very, very important to Trungpa Rinpoche. He introduced the Vajrayana teachings probably starting in 1976. Ironically, he introduced them as an alternative path for people who didn't want to become Buddhists. But at the same time, they are an amplification of the Vajrayana. They are another take on the Vajrayana, a way of coming into it. So what we're going to do is I'm going to send out an email and encourage people to get their hands on a copy of Shambhala, The Sacred Path of the Warrior. And we'll begin reading it probably next week. We'll begin with chapters 1 and 2. The chapters are relatively short. And there are a number of ways you can get it. I think it's available on Amazon for $9 and rapid shipping. Or there's a PDF, the pdffiles.com, where you can get it for free. Although I find that those files are harder to read than a book or a Kindle PDF. And so that's what we're going to be doing next week. I'm really quite excited about it. I think you'll find Shambhala, The Sacred Path of the Warrior, to be really beautiful and really powerful. And that we'll enjoy doing it together. So that's all I have to say. Thank you, Michael, for such an excellent presentation. And we could have a discussion.
I just wanted to comment. Well, first of all, Michael, thanks for a great presentation. And I like the clarification about what is kind of meant by Western versus Eastern, because I kind of started getting confused about that too. And I was like, well, what's wrong with a dishwasher, or something. But I like the idea of, like for me, what I'm hearing is that it's sort of like comfort. I like what you said, John, about like watching the ocean from hot tubs can be something that sort of fosters habitual patterns. And what I'm noticing lately, personally, is I see a lot of really old habitual patterns more clearly than ever, which I'm trying to look at as really good news, even though I still get caught up in them. And so So I appreciate, this viewpoint that at any given time I could, try to remind myself that I'm already awake. And I'm also curious about, how that can be, what's the word, kind of teased out more or unpacked more, perhaps with the Shambhala teachings.
Miriam has her hand raised.
Yes, thank you. I was going to say, I feel a little bit deflated because I started reading the third volume, very impressed by how big it is, and very excited about sinking my teeth into it. And, I started just the beginning and I haven't completed yet the readings for tonight, but I remember the excitement of just wanting to move forward and feeling like, yes, let's go. So so I'm happy to take a detour, and maybe the detour is really the destination as well. So I just wonder why the restraint around this Vajrayana. I don't understand the risk. And it's been hinted at more than once. So this is what I'd like for you to clarify.
I don't think we're pausing on the Vajrayana at all. Shambhala is the Vajrayana. It's these teachings, and they're very, very vivid and very approachable in terms of our experience. The Shambhala teachings, they were originally given by the Buddha to King Dawa Sangpo, also called Suchandra in Sanskrit, because he asked for teachings that were appropriate for lay people. He and his court were not going to become monks. And what the Buddha gave him were the Kala Chakra Tantra teachings. And these are pure, very high level Vajrayana. And this is the beginning of Shambhala, the Shambhala kingdom. This is the introduction to the beginning of the creation of Shambhala world. So I don't think we're putting off the Vajrayana. We're just taking sort of a new introduction into it, a different way of coming into it, with coming in through the Shambhala teachings. Trungpa Rinpoche, he gave us the Shambhala teachings at the same time as the Vajrayana teachings. And, one and both. I think they're very, very compatible and consistent, and that the Shambhala teachings will amplify our understanding of the Vajrayana. Michael, do you have a thought on this?
I'd say pretty much the same thing, that the Shambhala language is in some ways perhaps more accessible, in that, but that essentially it's all pointing to the same thing. And it's helpful to have that experience of having it pointed out in different ways, because it makes us less attached to the words and more able to tune into the experience. So I don't see it as you could think of it as a detour in the sense of what book we'd be working with, but in terms of what we're trying to understand and develop, and it's not a detour at all.
Thank you. I'm glad I asked.
No, a great question.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam.
I think Judith had her hand up. I don't know if she.
I think we're trying to make this as exciting and vivid as we can, and that by taking a slight, I don't even think it's a detour, by working with the Shambhala teachings, we're going to accomplish that kind of a greater vividness and warmth as we enter this third stage of the path. Sorry, Judith? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I thought in reading it by myself, there was a lot of, I don't know, new terms and got a little bit lost in that. But the presentation from Michael was just fabulous in making it approachable and understandable. So thank you so much for that. But the thing that really kept coming at me was the idea that awareness does not need to be created, just recognized, which kind of related to my other great revelation from what Dan said a few sessions ago about, about, I don't know where that phone is, about resting, not nesting, as far as the meditation goes. And I realized that I was getting annoyed because I was expecting something to happen. and it wasn't happening. So, you know, it really was a revelation that resting is what this process has to offer. So, so those two things are really, how many years have I been doing this? 40 years waiting for something to happen. It's unbelievable. But as Michael was saying, and Trungpa Rinpoche, it's a question of coming to it and gaining understanding and seeing things differently over time. And hopefully not kicking yourself too hard for taking that long. Oh, well. Yeah, great stuff. And I applaud us going through Sacred Path of the Warrior again. That sounds like a great idea. Over and out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Judith.
Mm-hmm.
We have two more raised hands here. Not sure who they are.
Val and Vicky.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Sue, for that William Blake quote. Love that quote. Wow. Gotta look that up. And yeah, sometimes meditation is such a revelation. I had two things came quickly to mind, and it's experiences when, say, I've been on vacation or traveled or encountered something that I have deemed as precious and remarkable. And there are other people around, and everybody's taking out a camera and taking a picture. And I'm like, sometimes I don't. And I have the thought, I do say it out loud, sometimes don't own it. I just want to be there with it. And sometimes I need to like grasp onto it. So I'm excited to learn more about not grasping. And the other thing came to me, I was like, what? You mean it's been here all this time? Like looking for something, like my glasses, where are they? They're right here on my head. It's here. I just can't see it sometimes. So thank you.
Vicky.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Valerie. I like your comment there. I had a question, something that confused me. On page 23, at the end of the paragraph at the top, it says, the combination of simplicity and fullness is the ultimate culture. Loneliness, it is where Vajrayana comes in. I got totally thrown by that word loneliness in there. I have no idea the kind of what to do with that. I didn't know if anyone else felt the same, but it's right before the Buddhahood section.
Yeah.
Buddhahood. About the rising and setting sun, and the rising sun is simplicity and fullness is the ultimate culture.
Mhm.
And then it says loneliness. So both as concepts of culture and loneliness.
So it's both culture and loneliness that you're asking about?
Yeah, that whole sentence, I feel completely like spun around. What does that mean?
Well, yeah, I'd be curious what people think.
I do have a think,
Go for it.
Please.
a little think. Well, first of all, there's a footnote there on the page. It says, although loneliness is commonly viewed as a negative quality, Trungpa Rinpoche constantly points out the positive role of loneliness on the Vajrayana path. And I relate to loneliness as non-attachment. In other words,
Uh-huh.
you know, I'm not sure how to state this really clearly, but to the extent that you have an attachment to another person, another thing, another circumstance being a certain way, then you're kind of bound to it. And as those attachments dissolve and you become more and more into the present and start living with your immediate experience, you are alone in a way and in relation, but you're alone.
Non-attachment I can deal with, definitely. I mean, conceptually. So,
I think I'd say the same thing, but maybe a little differently, but really the same thing, that we can't grasp or hold on to anything. Which is the way of talking about non-attachment, and that in a sense, and that each, our experience is unique. It's our experience, not anybody else's.
Mhm.
And so the culture, I think, is one of complete appreciation.
Yeah, what he said.
Yeah.
Remember what he
Wouldn't
said?
it still seems to me aloneness would be a better similar term than loneliness. I guess it's, it's not just the negativity that can be tied to the concept of loneliness, but aloneness and non-attachment to me seem more neutral. Okay, well, thank you. That helps. And I was completely missing the footnote. I should have seen that. So
I agree with you, Vicky, that the difference between loneliness and aloneness. If you go into solitary retreat, you might experience loneliness, especially in the beginning. And then the sorrow or the complaint of the loneliness fades,
yeah,
and there's aloneness,
yeah.
which has to do with self-sufficiency and appreciation of whatever it is that's arising in the moment. And yeah.
Yeah, the sorrow of the loneliness is transient. I do agree with that. It really helps to go ahead and, as we've been, as it's been described, let it in the door, don't invite it to tea, and then let it leave.
Yeah.
If I could add something to that, I agree with what you're saying, the aloneness and what John just said versus loneliness. But if he used that word, we wouldn't be questioning it the way we are. So I don't know if that's purposeful on his part or not, but it's, I do know that if he made a more accurate word in terms of our experiences, like self-sufficiency, then we wouldn't be questioning the whole thing. And I think it's a good thing to question. I think that was a great question, and it's I'm also looking at it as the difference between the two types of loneliness. Let's say, as one is setting sun loyalty, and one is the Great Eastern Sun loyalty, the rising sun. Because there's loneliness, there's a connection with people that's done just to avoid a negative feeling of loneliness. And then there's a connection with people that's done unconditionally. It's not to avoid some painful feeling or aversive feeling.
Makes sense.
So using a word like that brings up the whole process of thinking about it, for me. Anyway.
Kurt?
Yeah, with what you just said, Dan, it made me think of accepting the reality of these teachings, that we're in it alone, and our understanding is so individual, and our process is just with ourselves. And then I put that in the context of this Sangha, that we're all doing this alone together. And it gives me such appreciation for the Sangha and for each individual person, because I know from my own experience that each one of you are going through this process very alone. And there's such a beauty to that, and I see that is I don't see loneliness in that. I see a real connection and a gathering, but that gathering is based in reality, that we are all individually alone doing this process together. And, But I agree what you said, Dan. I think it's interesting that, he used the word loneliness, and I didn't appreciate it until you said that actually brings up the question within us of what is loneliness and what is alone. So, thank you.
Danielle and then Karen.
I think Karen had her hand up before me.
Oh, she did?
If you don't mind, she can
Either
go.
way. Either way.
Thank you, Danielle. To me, it struck me as in the Western mind, we see loneliness as a negative thing. It's attached to a negative emotion. And in the Eastern mind, I don't believe that that's the way it's seen. I think you can only really awaken to your true nature and be in the present in silence. I think that's where we find our most present self, is in silence. And obviously loneliness, being alone, is a part of that. So I think it's interesting. I agree. It's interesting he chose that word. It certainly led to a big discussion here. But yeah, I think that it's two different ways to look at loneliness, and I don't think he meant it in the negative sense. And also, I found it interesting what was said about how in the Western mind, we're always looking to entertain ourselves, to be on to the next thing. And, we society puts pressure on us to, be successful and do more and get more and own more and buy more. And it's all about pleasure. And whereas the sense in the Eastern mind is, it's more about responsibility to yourself, to your community, not in the same way. The responsibility is more about putting out effort, putting out effort, as opposed to like bringing things to yourself and gaining things for yourself. It's more about giving, and the Western mind to me is more about taking, if that makes any sense. That's what I got from the chapter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well said.
Indeed.
In the same vein, today I was thinking about, while I was driving, the concept of original sin, and how, it contrasts with this idea of, Buddhahood inside of us, and goodness. And in the same vein, like the Eastern thought and the Western setting sun, it's just so alien, it's so different. And so when I feel as time goes on and I learn more, it really is a whole different mindset from most of the people in the West. And sometimes that can be lonely feeling to me, because sometimes, people don't have the same viewpoint when you're thinking about concepts from Buddhism. But then, when I come to group, it's not that way. But so I think sometimes it's loneliness for me. I feel different, but it's just like different mindsets, so I just want to put that in there, and things like that.
I think that's right. It is a different mindset. Every now and then it really strikes me how, from the point of view of conventional mind, conventional existence, how really radical it is.
Kind of like with the concept of original sin, I don't really know, but it feels like you are already like traumatized by the concept of original sin, whereas the concept of, internal goodness, and it's just so much more, it's a lot different, different.
Yeah. Well, Michael, what do you think? If there are no more comments or
Yes.
questions, should we close?
I think so.
Okay. So I'll put the chants up. You'll lead us, Meg.
Yes.
And we'll see you all tomorrow. See some of you.
We will close with a prayer for peace and then dedicate the merit earned by our practice for the benefit of all sentient beings. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times and my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigden's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Michael. That was great.
Thank you,
That was
Michael.
really
Yeah,
great.
thank you.
Thank you,
Okay.
everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you
Michael.
all.
Thanks,
Thank you,
John.
everyone.
Michael.
Have a good night.
Thanks,
Michael.
Mayor.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everyone.
Night.
Good night.
Good night.
Appreciate it all. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. It was great.